I've spent a good deal of time catching speckled trout across Louisiana's coast, and there's something I've seen over the years that I find shocking. Most people get on speckled trout, but don't catch them. This is especially the case in deeper water, but also when I see them fishing shallow. They just screw it up. So what are they screwing up? Well, there's two things in particular, and that's what this video reveals. Watch and see if you've done one of these two things, and if so, then you'll see how to fix them. But first, let me introduce myself. My name is Devin. I'm a former fishing guide, lifelong inshore angler, and owner of Louisiana Fishing Blog. I make my living teaching people how to fish Louisiana's coast for speckled trout and redfish at my university, LAFB Elite. If you'd like to learn more, then visit LAFBElite.com or use the link in the video description below. But what you are watching here is a free course that was once hosted in that university, where it was called Elements of Effective Fishing, but it has been updated and formatted for YouTube. I just think that YouTube is probably a better place for this thing to live. So with that out of the way, let's get back to those two mistakes. What are they, and how do they keep people from catching speckled trout even when they're casting to them? Mistake number one, no good presentations. The first mistake is not giving a good presentation to the fish. If the fish cannot see your lure, then they cannot possibly bite it. It's that simple. This handy dandy doodle that I made details what I mean. The angler is casting to the fish, but his lure is getting swept back by the current. Now, the obvious problem is that he's not catching the fish, but the not so obvious problem is that he's not sure if there's even fish there to begin with. And I'll show you how to handle this in a minute. Mistake number two, not covering water. Many people trying to catch speckled trout or even redfish simply spend too much time in 1, 2, or even 3 spots and never find the mother lode of fish. So how can you get good presentations on fish? How can you know if a fishing spot is productive or not? How can you know when to leave or when to stay? What tools and knowledge do you need to accomplish this? These things and more are what this free course addresses. If you can watch this video all the way through, then you will come out on the other side a better fisherman. And if you don't watch the video all the way through, then, well, you don't know what you don't know. So with that out of the way, the best way we could get started is by looking at how speckled trout feed. The way speckled trout feed can be broken down into two categories: hunting and ambushing. Hunting is when a fish is actively swimming, patrolling across a body of water or down a shoreline looking for something to eat. We often see redfish feed in this way, especially in shallower ponds. Speckled trout and other species feed in this way too, but the more often used method of feeding is ambushing. This is when speckled trout stay put in one spot, usually somewhere there's good moving water, and ambush prey that flows to them with the current. This really works best for fish because they use less energy and get more food. Speckled trout especially use the ambush method, and this video from Tampa Bay Wild Images does an excellent job portraying this behavior. Notice how the trout are facing into the current at the bottom of the water column, eating bait flowing to them. This is how they tend to feed most of the time across Louisiana's coast, as they are creatures that leverage the tide to their advantage. The area in the water just ahead of them is what we would call the strike zone. Now note that this important area is not behind them, it's not above them, nor is it off to either side. It is directly in front of them where they are anticipating bait to be arriving from. It's important that you have this visual of how they feed in your mind, as you can apply it to wherever you are fishing in order to achieve the desired result, which is getting the bait in front of the fish. The fish are only looking one way, in the direction they anticipate bait to be arriving from. Casting your lure well ahead of them is the key to make sure that it ends up where they can see it and bite it. If you were to make a poor cast that causes the lure to pass like a few feet behind them, you probably won't get bit because that's not where they're looking, even though you still got your lure close to them. Or maybe you'll catch one occasionally, but not as often as if you got a good presentation to begin with. The faster that water moves and the deeper that it is, the more critical this concept becomes. Getting a lure into the strike zone is a lot easier in 3 to 5 feet of water because you can use a popping cork and you don't have to put much thought into it. Surprise, surprise, why do you think fishing popping corks is so popular in Louisiana? But Deeper, faster moving water, like 12 to 30 feet, really trips up inshore anglers because more thought and precision is required to get the bait in front of the fish, especially if the current is fast. This concept of putting your lure in the right spot so fish see it is called getting a good presentation. If you can look at any fishing spot on Louisiana's coast and, after judging the conditions, make a good presentation on fish that could be feeding there, then you would be a very formidable angler who can catch fish anywhere they swim. If you cannot do this, then you very well could be causing your lure to fly over the heads of fish and behind them where they never see it, effectively achieving a bad presentation. Or, conversely, fish could be feeding towards the top of the water column as they pursue fleeing bait, with like jumping shrimp being a good example. And those fish are better caught on a popping cork than something that sinks. A really good example of this would be that fishing trip in Mandeville, where I caught a limit of speckled trout in open water that is 12 foot deep. They were just feeding towards the surface on white shrimp, and a popping cork worked best. Now, this was painfully obvious because there were diving birds, there were jumping shrimp, and fish breaking the surface. But if they were deep, you wouldn't see this, and you would have to rely on making good presentations at the bottom of the water column. So how can we ensure that we always get a good presentation? What are the practical things that we need to put into practice? Well, there's a couple elements to it, and that's boat positioning and weight selection. And we'll get started with boat positioning. So what is boat positioning? It's where you place your boat in relation to feeding fish or wherever it is you think the strike zone could be. Good boat positioning allows you to achieve good presentations on speckled trout, whereas bad boat positioning is a recipe for missing them altogether. The key to good boat positioning is to place your boat off to the side of the strike zone in the current and cast upstream of it. This gives your lure enough space to fall to it, naturally flow to the fish and allowing them to bite it. So, you cast upstream, let your lure flow with the current, and once the lure is behind the strike zone, reel it back in and cast back out again. This is good boat positioning in a nutshell. If you try doing this by placing your boat like ahead or behind the strike zone, you may still get bit, just not as much. Worst case scenario, you'll miss the strike zone altogether and you won't get bit at all. This is because when your boat is positioned behind the strike zone, your lure won't reach the bottom in time, flying over the heads of the fish. They just never see it. Also, extra slack will be knocked into your line, making it difficult to feel the bite and set the hook. Now, when you position your boat ahead of the fish, it is more difficult for your lure to fall to the strike zone because the current is pushing against it, kind of like what wind does to a kite. So your life is a lot easier if you can position your boat to either side of the strike zone as it is oriented in the current. Not upstream or downstream, but off to the side. Now, with that said, it is possible to accommodate positioning upstream or downstream by learning how to fish with a slack line or by overweighting your rig. And I do both of these techniques on my fishing trips and they catch fish. With the trestles in Lake Pontchartrain being a great example of a place to practice slackline fishing, and the jump in Venice being an example of a place that's like a hot spot for overweighting. But slackline fishing is an advanced technique outside the scope of this video, and overweighting only allows you to fish a strike zone behind the boat and not off to either side. And the reasons why will become more obvious once we cover sinking weight here shortly. The next reason you want to achieve good boat positioning is to accommodate multiple anglers. Now, if you fish by yourself or like with an experienced fishing buddy, this isn't such a big deal, but when you have like 3 or more fishermen in the boat, good boat positioning goes a long way. This way, everyone can make good casts, catch more fish, and tangle lines less. This is accomplished when the whole side of the boat is available to cast from rather than just the stern or bow. After that, the next thing you want to consider is wind. You really don't want to be casting into the wind, it's just unnecessarily difficult. Doing so means you're spending more time fighting the wind than getting your lure to the strike zone. Now, when you have to deal with an amount of wind, well, that means that you won't have either side of the strike zone to position your boat on. Now you have to pick the side that puts the wind to your back. Now, this brings up the reality that some fishing spots will be more practical to fish than others the next time you launch your boat. It just is what it is, but at least now you know that's the case. This is why being able to select and identify many fishing spots based upon the conditions predicted the day of your fishing trip is so critical to your fishing success. And that's what I teach inside my flagship course in Shore Fishing 101. Just visit lafbelite.com to discover all of the benefits. Anyway, moving on. Now we've covered boat positioning, but that is not enough by itself. The next critical thing that many anglers overlook is weight selection. In order to establish the idea of weight selection, let's revisit how speckled trout ambush feed. They are waiting for bait to come directly to them via the current. Look at how they're facing forward into the current and see how the bait is naturally coming to them. That is what you want your lure to do, but it cannot do that if it weighs too little or too much. The method of getting this right is to choose the correct sinking weight. Well, what is sinking weight? It's the part of the lure that actually sinks. This includes, but is not limited to pieces of tackle like egg sinkers, jig heads, molded weights, bank sinkers, bullet weights, and more. If the lure you're throwing, or rig or whatever, doesn't have enough sinking weight, then it won't reach the strike zone. Instead, it will just pass over the fish and they'll never see it. If the lure weighs too much, it won't flow naturally to the fish. It may even stay glued to the bottom and hardly move at all. Yes, you could overweight a lure or rig and just hang it off the back of the boat, but then you'll only be fishing one spot, like one strike zone, and your lure won't be covering more real estate at the bottom of the water column. Overweighting works, but you have to know exactly where the fish are and they have to be feeding exceptionally well. Otherwise, heavier is not better. You'll benefit more from learning how to hit that perfect Goldilocks weight for getting good presentations. So, how heavy or how light should you go? Well, this depends on the water depth and water speed. The deeper the water and the faster it moves, the heavier weight you're going to need. And just to make identifying this sinking weight easier, I created this cheat sheet to help you get started. I suggest saving it with a screenshot or writing it down in order to reference it on your next fishing trip. This is just a guide. You could be in water that is moving so fast it's necessary to tie on the next heaviest weight. And seeing that we have no standardized method to measure water speed, it'll be up to you to learn this from experience. And a good way to get that is by knowing when your lure actually hits the bottom. The way to know this is by observing your fishing line after you cast. It will remain somewhat taut the entire time the lure is falling. But as soon as it hits the bottom, you'll see a significant bow drop into the line. It almost looks like it's relaxing as it suddenly sags a little bit. It just kind of gives out. This is how you know you got to the bottom and how you know you got a bait in front of any fish that could potentially be feeding down there. If you make several casts and you know you got your lure down to where the strike zone would be and you don't get bit, then you know there's probably no fish there and you can either cast somewhere else or leave that fishing spot. So by now you can see how this addresses the issue of knowing if feeding speckled trout are there or not. Look, these are not largemouth bass in Lake Conroe on day 3 of the Bassmaster Classic. These are speckled trout, and they're not particularly picky. What matters the most with them is getting a good presentation, and now you know how to do that. But there's more you need to know in order to tie all of this together. What we covered next are fan casting, fishing the entire water column, and knowing when to leave or stay. Fan casting. Wherever it is that you position your boat, it is likely that fish won't be at the spot you're casting at. If they're not, then that doesn't mean it's time to leave that fishing spot. That's because they could be somewhere nearby, and they could be within casting distance. So you don't want to reposition the boat umpteen times in a single spot. That's time consuming and requires way too much effort. The solution to this is fan casting, which is literally just casting in a fan around the boat, regardless of how the boat is positioned. If there's water a fish can occupy, then you want to put a lure there. Yes, the boat won't be perfectly positioned to get good presentations, but if you get any kind of feedback, then you can reposition to where you think the speckled trout are. This is much more efficient than constantly repositioning the boat. If you get anything like missed bites or following fish, then you'll know it's probably worth your time and energy to move your boat that short distance. This process of properly positioning your boat and selecting the correct sinking weight to get your lure into the strike zone is how you quickly eliminate unproductive water and zero in on biting fish. But there is one last thing that you need in your toolbox, and that's knowing when to leave. When should you leave a fishing spot? Everything you've learned so far, when applied correctly, gives you a good idea as to what is going on at a particular fishing spot. You will not be left wondering if speckled trout are feeding there or not. Either you will catch them or you will learn that they are not there, after which you are free to apply the process all over again at the next fishing spot again and again until you finally find them. But it's not always that obvious. You know, like maybe sometimes you caught a bunch of fish in that spot the day before, but today they're not there. Maybe you're catching some here and there, but not enough to really warrant staying. And I'll tell you that there is no cut and dry answer that fits every fishing trip. If you've seen my YouTube videos and you've seen fishing trips where I stuck with it and ground it out, and fishing trips where I ran the boat and burned some gas. However, with that said, here are some guidelines based upon those experiences you can apply on your future fishing trips. Leave when you catch nothing or only trash fish. If you get good presentations on that strike zone and you fan cast around and still only catch trash fish or nothing at all, then it's just time to go. Very rarely should you stay and wait. Leave if you are only catching throwbacks. If you're only catching throwbacks, then that's probably all there is. The only exception to this, at least for me personally, is if it's an obviously difficult day of fishing and wading through throwbacks to catch keepers is an acceptable form of grinding that can produce a decent box of fish. Leave if you only catch one keeper here and there. Very generally speaking, I'd leave a spot if it's only giving up keepers like at a very slow rate. For example, if I were only catching a speckled trout once every 15 minutes, that would be reason enough for me to leave. For sure, they are biting better somewhere else, and in the worst case scenario, you can always come back and grind. The only way that I would stay catching them like that is if I thought it would be consistent enough to slowly grind out a decent box or even a limit. What you don't want to do. What you don't want to do is just sit there and change lure colors all day, or change out live bait, or otherwise make trivial changes in your tackle that don't really amount to anything. At this point in time, you know how to get good presentations on fish. If you do that and you get 0 bites, then there's probably nothing there. Getting more fishing spots and covering more water. At the end of the day, if there are speckled trout at a spot, they will give you some kind of feedback. They will bust bait in front of you, they will follow your lure to the boat, they'll nip at your bait, something will happen to give themselves away. I've had this happen on more trips than one, and once it happened, it was a matter of time before I dialed them in and caught a limit. These things will become more apparent to you as you spend time on the water and gain experience. And that experience will come to you much faster now that you have a process for fishing each spot on your trip. But how do you know which fishing spots to pick out? Well, I'd say that it's a safe bet to pick out about a dozen fishing spots in a particular area. These could be major points, tide lines, bends and bayous, oyster reefs, cypress dumps, deep holes, and a whole lot more. How to identify these fishing spots and the best time to fish them is what I teach inside my course Inshore Fishing 101, which is part of my membership, LAFB Elite. When you join LAFB Elite, you gain instant access not just to Inshore Fishing 101, but all of my courses as well as the LAFB Elite community, where you can read detailed fishing reports and get help planning your next fishing trip. It's all on my website. No social media or extra logins required. If you'd like to learn more, then please visit lafbelite.com or use the link in the video description below. Tight lines, and thank you for watching.